This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so good morning and good afternoon, I guess, for some. So thank you for joining us as we provide an overview of the proposed bylaw changes that were recently approved by the Board of Directors at our January Board of Directors meeting. And you'll see later on that bylaws cannot be modified without the support of our membership, and we intend to have a vote on the proposed bylaw changes at the annual general meeting in Nashville on May 4th. But we won't have time to go through all the changes during the annual general meeting, and so we're doing this ahead of time, and this will allow people to absorb the changes that are being proposed and ask questions between now and the AGM. So with that being said, is there anybody on the line that cannot see the screen? Nope. Okay. All right. So seems like my screen's frozen now. Bear with me. I'm just trying to get to the agenda. So we'll go through why there is a need to revisit the bylaws. We'll talk about what the proposed changes are and the approval process going forward. With that being said, I'll invite Dimitri to give us the context around the need for the bylaw review. Over to you, Dimitri.
Great. Oh, getting a little bit of an echo there. Can everybody please put themselves on mute?
Yeah, if you don't mind putting yourselves on mute, that would be appreciated.
All right. I think we're good. Well, thank you for that. And again, good morning and good afternoon. And what we, as Dan mentioned, what we wanted to walk you through today is our proposal to amend or update the bylaws. And just maybe at the outset to let everybody know, we will be making this presentation available on the members only site of the CAPDM website. So if you do want it afterwards, you can grab it. You can go there and review it and print it out. Dan, can everybody hear me? I'm still getting an echo.
Yeah, we're still getting an echo. And I'm just wondering, if there's people who don't have themselves on mute, if you don't mind going on mute. It seems like we were successful for a few seconds there. Let's try it now, Dimitri.
Okay, we're good. That's fabulous, and thanks again. Obviously, for those of you who are not who've not had a chance to review our bylaws in the last little while, you'll find when you pick them up that they're quite out of date. They've not been amended or updated for a number of years. I would say probably in the last 10 years they've not been updated. And in addition to being a legal requirement for our organization, it also gives us the guardrails and goalposts for which we are to govern ourselves and ultimately serve the membership. So we identified earlier on in this year or last year that the current bylaws have fallen a little bit out of date in terms of who's part of CAPDM, who are there to serve, and how we govern ourselves in our board meetings. So as a board of directors, we decided that it was probably time for us to update it. And as a matter of best practices, bylaws should be reviewed by their respective organizations at minimum every 5 to 7 years. So certainly for us, after this update, our plan is to have a much regular cadence around reviews to make sure that our bylaws continue to represent who we are, what we do, and the membership we represent. So in terms of what the process we took to do this, we struck, I guess, a committee. So the executive committee of the board looked at the current bylaws, word for word, page by page, and identified where the bylaws no longer are in sync or represent how the organization currently governs or wishes to govern itself going forward. After a number of meetings and deliberation discussions, we presented these recommendations to the board. The board then unanimously approved the recommendations, and now we're socializing these recommendations with the broader membership for a final vote at our upcoming AGM. So really, what are the objectives of the review? Ensure that the governance process is right. Ensure that that we have an inclusive organization, and that we have bylaws that are up to date and represent our current membership, and again, and how we conduct our business. And obviously, as a result of that review, if amendments are required, follow the due process described in the bylaws, which we have been doing and which we're doing today. So, with that, I think before I hand it over to Dan, I just wanted, to say a few comments about this. I mean, this is, for the most part, a bit of a routine exercise we're undertaking. We did identify there was at least, one thing in our bylaws that doesn't currently, I would say, is no longer contemporary and represents our membership, and it really relates around voting privileges and rights. So that was really the reason why one of the main reasons we undertook. But obviously, as we went through this exercise, we identified a number of things that needed to be updated. And so at this point, I'll hand it over to Dan, who will walk you through these changes. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dimitri, and certainly as chair of the CAPDM Board of Directors, I appreciate you setting the context for our members to understand the reasons and what the proposed changes will be. I will invite those that have questions to ask questions as we go, but we also have provided for time at the end for Q&A session as well. So the key pillars for as we had the board sort of start to review the bylaws, the key principles that we were adhering to is essentially that CAPDM is the trade association for full service pharmaceutical wholesale industry in Canada. And the primary purpose is to protect the interests of members whose primary business is broad-based pharmaceutical wholesaling. And obviously we have other members of the supply chain that may not be direct wholesalers. We have manufacturers, we have service providers, and we recognize that the industry and the ecosystem for pharmaceutical distribution is as well broader than just the wholesale piece. Now, there's members like the manufacturers, like retailers that have their own trade associations, but CAPDM is really the one that targets the wholesalers and those whose business model is primarily wholesaling. But we nevertheless want to, I'm still getting a bit of an echo, so if there's somebody on the line that hasn't muted their phone, if you don't mind muting it, that'll be easier for those that are listening. So again, we recognize that the supply chain model continues to evolve in the Canadian setting, and we want to continue to be the voice of the industry and to advance the positions of not only the wholesalers, but the broader supply chain community at large. The changes that are being proposed fall under 5 different categories: administrative changes, changes to the purpose of the association, changes to the member definition and emission standards, the board composition and its functions, and as well as committees of the board. And we're going to go through these changes now. On the administrative side, one of the things that was that is in the current bylaws is that the association must have its head office in Vaughan, Ontario. And from my perspective and from the board's perspective, there's no reason why it must be. It can be in Vaughan and is in Vaughan, but there's no other requirements as to why it should be and must be in Vaughan. So we've removed that article in the new proposed bylaws. Article 2 of the bylaws talks about the purposes and objectives of the association. We also have in our articles of continuance or articles of incorporation now the same purpose and objectives. And as we modify and look to update the purposes and objectives, now we're at risk of having a divergent language between what's in the bylaws and what is in our articles of continuance. So what we've proposed to do is to remove the article itself, Article 2, from the bylaws and have the purpose and objectives of the association contained solely in the articles of continuance. And that will just avoid potential divergence down the road. We're also looking at the admission applications for associate members being service providers and manufacturers, those that are not in the distribution business per se. And currently those applications get reviewed by the nominating committee and then approved by the board. And the proposal now is to have the review and the approval done at the nominating committee level, as opposed to floating it up to the entire board. So that's one of the changes that's in the proposed bylaw. Membership suspension or termination appeals process. There was some redundancy in Article 6, Item 8. Essentially, it said, a member that is suspended or terminated has a right to appeal. It appeals to the board, and there was a duplicate clause in there that says if you're not happy with the appeal process through the board, then you can actually submit again to the board. And so there was no need for that duplication to exist. So we removed Item 8 from Article 6. As Dimitri mentioned, it's been a long time since CAPDM and the board of directors reviewed on a comprehensive fashion our bylaws, and we're going to be more explicit in the new proposed bylaws around the timing for the bylaw reviews, and that's going to be in Article 18. And currently Article 18 talks about a dispute resolution through mediation and arbitration. Again, that's contained in Article 6, so we're trying to remove some duplication on that front as well. Any questions on the administrative changes?
Hey Dan, it's Morad.
Yes.
Had a question on the new associate member approval. So that's by the nominating committee now. So can you give me just a general idea, who is on the nominating committee?
So currently, the nominating committee is a subcommittee of the board, and we have so Michel Robidoux, Dimitri Polygenis, Ron Frisch, and John Target are the 4 members of our board that represent the nominating committee today.
Okay, so it is made up of board members. That's
Correct.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other further questions before I move on to the next series of changes? So the purpose of the association, I've talked about this already. So essentially, it is to promote the use of primary wholesalers whose business model is wholesaling. And now we're sort of incorporating some changes in the articles of continuance, and we've removed the reference to the purpose of the association from our bylaws. So I'll go through what those look like. So this slide here talks about what is currently in our articles of continuance. And we're planning on amending those articles of continuance to essentially expand on the purpose and the objectives of the association. And it picks up on what we had previously, and it sort of adds to it some clarity around the promotion of the use of primary wholesalers, which is item F on this slide. So before I move on from that point, in terms of purpose and objectives of the association, are there any questions? Okay, the third series of changes are around membership definition and admission standards. Currently, we have multiple categories of distributors, and what we're planning to do is streamline the classes of membership under two primary categories. The first one being primary wholesaler, and that will replace previous full consolidated category and allied distributor category. So both of them will then be merged into a primary wholesaler category. And then there will be another distributor category called other distributor, which will include self-distributing pharmacy chains and specialized distributors. And specialized distributors is a little different than specialty distributors, which is what we have in our current bylaws. And I'll talk about that now. So specialized distributors in our bylaws essentially talk about organizations that have specialty distribution of specialty pharmaceuticals, that have patient support programs and specialty pharmacies associated with it. And so those will still be contained under specialized distributors, but we're planning on expanding the definition of specialized distributors to include those wholesalers who have a license through Health Canada and whose business is the orderly distribution of a limited category of pharmaceutical products. That will include specialty pharmacy distributors, but it will also include what some people refer to as shortliners, organizations like LPG, for example, out of Hamilton, that have a limited number of products and have limited geography. They were prevented from being a distributor member as per our existing bylaws, but they would be a candidate to be included in this association if these proposed changes go forward. So again, there's some changes in terms of you don't have to carry 80% of the products. You can carry a limited number of products as long as you're a licensed Health Canada wholesaler. Then you become a candidate for being a member within one of those distribution categories. Previously, you had to operate in a minimum of 2 provinces. We're planning on removing that as well, so you can operate in one single province and still be a candidate to join CAPDM. The other change around membership definitions is the current bylaws speak about international, complementary, and honorary membership. Nobody can recall ever using those categories of members, and so the proposal is to eliminate those categories of membership. So before I move on to the next category, are there any changes, any questions, I should say, with respect to membership definition and admission standards? Yeah, so in essence, it is meant to be that much more inclusive of the distribution ecosystem that is operating in Canada. The next item is around changes to board composition and function. Generally recognize that currently we have Colin Frisch and McKesson who have 2 board members, while others have 1 board member, and that essentially yields 2 votes for each for Colin Frisch and McKesson. And there's the optics of inequity, and we've heard that feedback not only from board members but also from members at large, and so we're trying to address that. The sense is from our board that a second representative from either Colin Frisch or McKesson is not required for governance purposes. And historically, the 2 votes that were allocated to McKesson and Colin Frisch were to ensure that the mandate stayed consistent with the association mandate, which is essentially representing the primary interest of wholesalers. So the board has taken great effort in terms of trying to fix these optics and come up with a new board composition framework that would address this. So the proposal is to shrink the board to 5 directors. Currently, we operate with 9 directors, but we would shrink it to 5 directors who would come from primary wholesalers and other distributors. Primary wholesalers would hold the majority with 3 directors. Other distributors would have 2 directors represent them on the board. So currently, we have, from a primary wholesaler perspective, we've got Colin Frisch, McKesson, and Unifarm. And so those three entities could remain on the board and would form the three directors. From the other distributor category, currently our board has Shoppers Drug Mart and Innomar represented. That represents the self distributors and the specialized distributors. So that would constitute the five directors of the board going forward if the bylaw changes are approved. So the primary wholesalers, again, now the change would be that they would actually have one vote and one seat. So the national wholesalers, Colin Frisch and McKesson, would have a single vote each, and we would remove the second representative from Colin Frisch and McKesson. Allied and regional distributors would have the third vote under the primary wholesaler. And from a bylaw perspective, given that the CAPDM is a national organization, the intention is to have the national wholesalers make up 2/3 of the primary wholesalers, but not less than the majority of the primary wholesaler seats. And from another distributor perspective, we would pick two directors from the retail sales distributor category, and currently we have Shoppers Drug Mart, the Jean Coutu Group, and Gamma Wholesale as self-distributors. And under specialized distributors, we currently have Innomar, BioScript, Bayshore, ConnectRx, and any other shortliner that we would bring forward. So those would be the members of the board in terms of voting members. Associate members are encouraged to actively participate as observers of the board. And so this allows us a couple of things. It allows us to, as the board deems appropriate, to bring as many voices to the board as we feel appropriate. So currently we have a manufacturer representative from the brand side, and that's Bayer currently, and we have a manufacturer representative from the generic side, and that's Sandoz currently. And so we will encourage both the manufacturer and the service providers to have their voices heard at the board level. They will not be deemed to be voting directors, but they will be participating observers. And again, from the outset, we understand that the supply chain is more comprehensive than simply the wholesalers. So we want to hear from many of the voices from our membership, and this allows us to bring as many observers to the boardroom table as appropriate. So there won't be a limit to the number of observers. It will be at the discretion of the board, but this allows us, the primary objective is to increase the voice of the membership at the board level. So the board composition, as we mentioned, would be streamlined. There will only be one representative per member organization. The quorum at the board level would be reached when the majority of the primary wholesalers and a majority of the entire board is present at the board meetings. Our current bylaws talk about a past chair, and the proposal is to switch the past chair language to more of a vice chair to reflect the current realities of board member transition. And so currently, if the past chair isn't on the board anymore, we'd still have a need for a vice chair. So we're planning on doing away with the past chair and bringing forward a vice chair who will essentially play the role of the chair in the event that the chair is not available to chair the board meetings and or the annual general meetings. From a term perspective, as an elected board member, the primary wholesaler directors shall serve for a term of 3 years, and that's consistent with what the current bylaws say. And directors from other distributors will have a 1-year renewable term. So that's a bit of a change, and that is to reflect the feedback we've received in terms of some members say, you know what, I wouldn't mind being on the board, but a 3-year term is a heavier commitment than I'm prepared to put forward. And it doesn't prevent somebody who's on the board as another distributor to renew their term if that's of interest to them. But for those who may not want to commit for 3 years, they can nevertheless put their name forward to the nominating committee to become a board member, but it would be for a 1-year term. And that term would be renewable, but if the person elected that not to renew their term, then it allows other people to come forward to the board.
Dan?
Yes.
Dan, so Denis Tremblay, Pfizer. Just a question on the proposal to remove the vote for the industry or the manufacturer representation. I'm not clear on your explanation why it's going to give the board more flexibility or latitude. Could you elaborate a bit? Because for me, it's a big change, and I understand the concept of the observer, but you could appreciate that an observer and a voter is two different things. Could you just elaborate a bit on that, Dan, please?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for your question, Denis. So, and this is something that both Michel Lebidou and Eric Proditis, who are the board members representing the manufacturer interest currently, weighed in as well. And so, the notion is that from a voting perspective, what we wanted to do is not get ourselves tied up into we can't have this person on the board or that person on the board because it will impact the balance of the votes. And again, currently we have people who have 2 votes or organizations that have 2 votes in order to protect the balance of votes in favor of the primary wholesalers and the wholesale community. And in order to remove the optics of some people having 2 votes while others only have 1 vote, we came up with the concept of saying, okay, well, let's keep the voting to the distributor members and bring as many voices to the table from associate members, as well as the option is there to add more distributor members as observers as well, to bring more voices as appropriate to the board table, without necessarily impacting the voting structure that we're protecting in terms of having the wholesaler community, its interest represented through the voting scheme. So honestly, Denis, from a board perspective, there hasn't been any votes that have been brought forward where we haven't had consensus. So we don't feel that removing a voting privilege is a big factor. It has the potential nuance of saying, well, no, I used to have a vote, and now I'm only an observer. But what we really are seeking to have is the right voices at the table to influence the direction that the board will take for CAPDM as an association. Does that provide sufficient clarity, Denis?
Thank you, yes.
All right. The last item in terms of from a board perspective, there's a number of items that are duties of the directors. One of the items was to limit cash gifts, donations, etc., to under $10,000, and the proposal is to remove that. We don't see a reason why the association needs to be handcuffed in terms of having donations or sponsorships or whatnot, and limited to $10,000. And so, from a best practice perspective, we checked in with legal counsel on this one. It's not a typical clause for an association to have, and so from a practical perspective, we're proposing to remove that from the bylaws. So again, from a voting privilege perspective, each director that will be present at the board meeting and qualified to vote will have 1 vote and only 1 vote. In the event of a tie, the motion will be lost, and any individual that has been invited as an observer or guest to attend the board meeting, but has not been elected as a director, will not be entitled to vote. But again, as I mentioned in the question from Denis, the spirit of this is to bring more voices to the table as opposed to restricting the number of voices at the table. And those voices will influence the directors that have the power to vote, obviously. Are there questions around board composition and the voting privileges? Okay, the last series of changes are around the committees of the board. So the first three bullets exist in our current bylaws. There is a finance committee, there is a nominating committee, there is an executive committee, and those are all provided for in our current bylaws. And what we've proposed is, at the discretion of the board, is to bring forward potentially a new committee that would oversee government and industry stakeholder relations. And that is essentially to ensure that there is consistency when we CAPDM show up at government meetings or industry stakeholder meetings, that there's a consistency of the message, and that we show up as CAPDM, and in some cases we've confused our audience because we've brought too many players around the table, and that hasn't served us well. And so we're going to look at how do we actually position ourselves when meeting with industry stakeholders and government bureaucrats and politicians in terms of representing the objectives and the purpose of the association in as straightforward a fashion as possible. Questions around committees? Okay, the approval process. So as I mentioned at the outset, a change to the bylaws requires a special resolution to which members of our association need to approve. And so I'm not going to go through all the items on this list, but these are the items that if they change, it requires the approval of the membership. And more specifically, amendments of the bylaws require the majority of the board of directors at a meeting of the board of directors to be sanctioned in affirmative vote. And happy to say, as Dimitri mentioned, it was a unanimous decision from the board to bring forward to the membership the proposed bylaw changes. And then we will need an affirmative vote of at least 2/3 of the voting members at a meeting duly called for the purpose of considering the said bylaws. And we will bring this motion forward at the annual general meeting in May in Nashville. And so because we won't have time to, again, go through all these changes, that's why we were actually going through the changes with our members today, and we had a previous session on February 19th. And for those who are going to be unable to join either session, the recorded session with the presentation will be on our website under the members section, so they'll be able to refer to it as well, and so that people who are voting at the AGM will know what they're voting on. So lastly, so again, from a timetable perspective, the board approved the proposed bylaw changes at our board meeting on January 14th. Now, Dimitri, as our board chair, and myself, committed to host an information session for our membership at large, and that we were doing so in February. So this is the second of two that we're hosting, and there'll be a period, obviously, between now and the AGM where our membership will be able to ask further questions if they've got a need for clarification, and that can take place between March and April. And as I mentioned, the membership will vote on the bylaw changes at the AGM on May 4th in Nashville. If approved, then we will file the updated bylaws with Industry Canada, and the new bylaws will be implemented as of May of 2020. So that concludes the presentation part of the webinar. Are there questions either on the approval process or any of the sections that we've covered already? And before opening up the questions, maybe Dimitri, are there any sort of closing comments from your perspective for consideration by the membership?
Well, let me just reiterate some things you've already said, Dan. Is that really the objectives here in this exercise were to achieve, I would say, four things, or at least the committee that put forward these recommendations was trying to kind of triangulate four, I would say, anchors as we looked at the bylaws. Number one was to clean them up and ensure there isn't anything in there that nobody can explain. And those kind of fall under the administrative changes that we've walked through. Number two, the Canadian pharmaceutical supply chain is complex. There are a number of stakeholders, and we wanted to ensure that we maintained inclusivity as an organization to ensure all of those stakeholders, regardless of how they participate, have a voice and have input as we engage various healthcare stakeholders. Number three is to address a voting anomaly that not only I think presented an equity issue, but also was no longer contemporary in terms of how it represented the distribution community. And last, I think, is to ensure that the CAPDM agenda always continues to stay focused on the needs of those companies that are in the business of wholesaling. And so we looked at a number of options, and I think none of the other alternatives were as simple as the one we're putting in front of you in terms of meeting all of those four needs and ensuring we can go about our business. And as Dan mentioned earlier, you can feel confident and assured that the current board of directors is a very functional group, and that's always a good sign of all organizations. That we don't usually have any votes that don't have full consensus, and we usually don't have any item that we deliberate on that we don't have complete input across the supply chain. So I think I want you to keep that in mind. It wasn't an easy exercise, and certainly, we appreciate that we've made some changes. But again, everyone on the board, whether it be a manufacturer, wholesaler, a self-distributing retailer, specialty, all gave us approval to put this in front of you. So I think those are kind of my closing comments, Dan.
All right. Well, thank you, Dimitri. And as you were speaking, it sort of reminded me as well, and to complement, my answer to Denise' question, the observers will nevertheless be invited and encouraged to participate in board committee work as well. And so we're not trying to shut people out of the board meetings. In fact, we're trying to create a structure where we're going to be more inclusive, as Dimitri outlined, and encouraging voices throughout our stakeholder community to be present, to be active, and as I mentioned, encouraged to participate in the committees of the board as well. So with that being said, hopefully we can answer more questions because we got a bit of time on this webinar. So if there's any other questions, please ask those questions, and don't be shy, because if you've got a need for clarification, more than likely then somebody else on the call will have the same desire to hear the answer. So over to you guys for questions. All right, going once, twice. Very well. So if there's no further question, we will, as Dimitri outlined earlier, put the recorded presentation on the member section of the CAPDM website for further reference for those that have already attended, and for those that were not able to attend, they'll be able to listen in as well. So, but I would nevertheless encourage you, if through discussions with your peers and your colleagues in your organization, there's still a lack of clarity, or there's still some questions around why and how, then we've got essentially a couple months to be at your disposal, both from a board of directors perspective, and Dimitri, and certainly myself and the staff at CAPDM, to answer your questions. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us for any further clarification. And with that being said, I will wish you all a great Friday, and hoping you all have a great weekend ahead of you. So bye for now, and we'll look forward to seeing you and talking to you, if not before, in Nashville in early May. Bye for now.